I still remember the exact sound the fluorescent lights made that morning because it was the last ordinary thing I heard before my whole life flipped upside down. Funny how people think the biggest moments arrive with dramatic music or some warning from the universe. But mine came as a sheet of paper taped crooked across an old gray locker door. 3 weeks later, the same hospital executives who called me disposable were sitting across a polished conference table begging me to come back, and every single one of them avoided looking me in the eye. My name is Daniel Mercer. I'm 48 years old, and for almost 17 years I worked the overnight facility shift at St. Andrew Regional Medical Center outside Columbus, Ohio. Most people called me the janitor, because that's all they ever saw. The guy pushing a floor machine through empty hallways at 2 in the morning while everyone else slept. Right. The truth is, my job had quietly grown into something nobody bothered to put on paper. I knew every strange noise that building made. Every old pipe that rattled before a pressure spike. Every electrical panel that liked to trip after heavy rain. Every shortcut that kept expensive equipment alive long enough for the engineers to fix it the next morning. None of that was in my title. And apparently none of it mattered to the people upstairs. At least that's what they believed. The worst part wasn't even losing the paycheck. My wife, Emily, had started immunotherapy after a long fight with breast cancer, and our insurance came through the hospital. Every treatment, every scan, every prescription depended on that coverage. We'd spent months pretending not to notice how quickly our savings account was shrinking, because as long as I kept showing up every night, we figured we'd survive. I parked my old pickup behind the loading dock just like I had thousands of times before, grabbed my coffee, nodded to the security guard named Pete, and joked that somebody should finally replace the vending machine because it was older than both of us. Pete laughed and said, "Careful, Dan. They'll replace us before they replace that machine." Neither of us knew how close that joke was to becoming real. When I reached my locker, there it was, a white envelope taped across the door with my employee badge already deactivated inside. Effective immediately. Position eliminated. Budget restructuring. Please contact Human Resources with any questions. No meeting. No handshake. No thank you after nearly 2 decades of nights. Holidays, snowstorms, floods, power outages, and weekends that I'd missed with my family because hospitals never close. I stood there staring at the paper longer than I probably should have. I wasn't angry at first. I was confused. Confused people don't yowl. They just keep rereading the same sentence hoping it changes. I called Human Resources from the hallway, and after sitting on hold long enough to finish my coffee, a woman whose voice I'd never heard before answered like she was reading from a script. "Mr. Mercer, your position has been identified as non-essential under the current operational restructuring." I actually laughed because I thought she was joking. "Non-essential?" I asked. "I've been on call every Christmas for the last 15 years. She paused just long enough to make it obvious she wasn't listening. "We appreciate your years of service." That's corporate language for goodbye. Then she mentioned they had already hired 3 contract workers who would split my responsibilities. 3 people with 3 days of orientation. I remember staring through the window toward the mechanical wing, thinking, 3 days? It took me 3 years just to understand that boiler room. About an hour later, I was called upstairs to meet with the vice president of operations, a man named Richard Collins. Expensive watch, polished shoes, smile that never quite reached his eyes. He slid a folder across the table without even asking me to sit down. "Sign this severance agreement and you'll receive 2 weeks of pay." I flipped through the pages. Hidden inside was a waiver releasing the hospital from future claims. "What happens to my insurance?" I asked quietly. Richard leaned back like we'd moved into small talk. "Your benefits end at midnight." I swallowed hard. "My wife's in treatment," he sighed, checked his watch, then shrugged. "I'm sorry about your personal situation, but facilities employees are replaceable. Honestly, Dan, custodial staff are a dime a dozen. We'll have 3 younger guys doing your work for less money by next week." I wish I could tell you I stood up and delivered some clever speech, but real life doesn't work like the movies. My hands shook. My throat tightened. All I managed to say was, "I'm not signing this today." Richard smiled with that confident little grin people wear when they're convinced they've already won. "You'll change your mind." Maybe he believed that. Maybe everyone in that building believed it. As I walked back through the service corridor carrying the cardboard box with 17 years of coffee mugs, family photos, and a worn-out flashlight I'd bought with my own money, I passed the new contractors laughing while one of them asked another where the emergency generator room even was. They had no idea the question alone told me everything. That was the moment something clicked in my head. Not revenge, not anger. Just a simple realization. There were dozens of systems inside that hospital nobody had ever bothered documenting. Because for 17 years they had simply called me whenever something went wrong. They never asked how I fixed it. They never wrote it down. They never imagined the knowledge could walk out the door. I drove home in complete silence, set the cardboard box on the kitchen table, looked at Emily as she immediately knew something terrible had happened. And after we sat together for a long time without saying much, one memory kept replaying in my head louder than everything else Richard had said. A dime a dozen. Those 4 words refused to leave me. And before I finally went to bed that afternoon, I made one phone call that would change far more lives than anyone inside St. Andrew Regional could possibly imagine. The phone call itself lasted less than 10 minutes, and honestly it wasn't nearly as dramatic as people imagine when they hear the story. I didn't accuse anyone of breaking the law. I didn't threaten a lawsuit, and I certainly didn't tell the state inspector that the hospital was about to collapse. I simply explained that St. Andrew Regional had terminated the only overnight facilities technician responsible for maintaining several undocumented critical infrastructure systems, and that his replacements had received only a few days of orientation. The woman on the other end became noticeably quieter. She asked me to repeat the part about undocumented procedures. I did. Then she asked whether those systems involved emergency power, medical gases, or life safety equipment. I answered yes to all 3. Her last sentence before hanging up was, "Thank you for bringing this to our attention." That was it. No promises, no threats, just those 7 words. Life at home immediately became a strange mix of panic and routine. Emily tried to act stronger than she felt, insisting we'd figure everything out somehow. But every evening, I caught her staring at the stack of medical bills sitting on the kitchen counter. We stopped ordering takeout. We canceled streaming services we barely watched anyway. I called every facilities company within 50 miles, but every interview ended the same way. They liked my experience, then hesitated when I explained why I had left the hospital. Nobody wanted to hire the guy who had just been part of a budget reduction because everyone assumed budget reductions meant poor performance. That's the ugly truth about layoffs. People say, it's not personal, but somehow it always follows you like a shadow. 4 days after my termination, I woke up around 2 in the afternoon to my phone buzzing non-stop. Pete, the overnight security guard, had left 3 missed calls and 6 text messages. The last one simply read, "Generators down." I stared at the screen for several seconds before setting the phone face down on the table. Emily looked at me from across the kitchen. "You're thinking about going in, aren't you?" I smiled a little. "They already replaced me," she nodded, and neither of us said another word. Later that evening, Pete finally reached me. "Dan, this place is a circus." Apparently, a storm had rolled through just after midnight, knocking out commercial power across part of the county. Normally, that wasn't a disaster because the hospital's backup generator would automatically start, except every couple of weeks the transfer controller developed a timing fault that prevented synchronization. It wasn't an official defect anymore because I had discovered a manual reset sequence years earlier. 7 switches, 2 breaker delays, 1 pressure verification. 90 seconds if you knew exactly what you were doing. Nobody else did. The new contractor spent nearly 40 minutes reading manuals that didn't mention the workaround because there wasn't supposed to be one. The emergency contractor they called took almost 2 hours to arrive. During those 2 hours, surgeries were postponed, intensive care units switched to emergency conservation procedures, and administrators ran through hallways shouting into phones. The next morning, local news reported only a temporary power disruption. Internally, it had been far worse. I wish I could say I enjoyed hearing about the chaos. But the truth is, every patient inside that building mattered to me. I'd watched children recover there. I'd held elevators open for exhausted nurses carrying newborn babies. I'd watched families cry outside operating rooms more times than I could count. My frustration wasn't with the doctors or nurses. It was with executives who believed experience could be replaced by a spreadsheet. 5 days later, another call came, this time from Marcus, one of the senior maintenance mechanics who still worked days. "Dan, they keep asking us questions we can't answer." We talked for nearly an hour. He sounded exhausted. The 3 new contractors weren't lazy. They simply didn't know what nobody had ever taught them. One accidentally shut down a chilled water loop trying to diagnose an alarm. Another reset the wrong electrical panel because the labels hadn't matched reality in years after multiple renovations. Marcus finally sighed. "They're blaming us now." I wasn't surprised. Organizations rarely blame decisions. They blame people. Then came day 9. I was mowing the lawn when Pete called again, and I could hear alarms screaming through his phone before he even spoke. "Medical gas system," he yelled. "They're evacuating patients." My stomach dropped. The central oxygen monitoring system had developed an odd software conflict years earlier after a firmware update. Every few months, the sensors would report false pressure loss unless the network sequence was restarted in exactly the right order. I had shown that process to 3 supervisors over the years, but every one of them retired or transferred. Nobody ever documented it because management insisted software vendors should handle software problems. The vendor response time was 4 hours. Patients didn't have 4 hours. By sunset, helicopters were transferring critical patients to neighboring hospitals while administrators stood outside giving carefully worded statements to reporters about technical issues. Emily watched the coverage beside me in complete silence before finally asking the question neither of us had wanted to say out loud. Could this have been prevented? I took a long breath. Yes. Would they have listened if you warned them before they fired you? I laughed once, without humor. I spent years warning them. 3 days later, another story hit the news. A boiler in the East Mechanical Plant experienced dangerously high pressure after routine maintenance. That boiler had one stubborn bleed valve that needed manual adjustment every few weeks because replacing it required shutting down an entire wing. Administration always delayed the repair because it was expensive. I compensated for it during every inspection. The new contractors followed the official maintenance checklist perfectly. The checklist happened to be incomplete. The fire marshal temporarily closed 2 patient wings until independent engineers confirmed the system was safe. That's when government inspectors officially arrived. State health investigators, Medicare compliance auditors, fire safety officials, insurance representatives. Suddenly, every maintenance log I'd handwritten over 17 years became evidence. Every email I'd ever sent recommending permanent repairs resurfaced. Every budget request that had been denied found its way into investigative files. My attorney, Rebecca Sloan, called me that Friday afternoon sounding more excited than I had ever heard a lawyer sound. "Daniel, don't contact anyone at the hospital. Don't answer questions unless I'm present. They're digging into employment records now." I asked what she meant. She said something that completely changed my understanding of what had happened. "You weren't terminated as a janitor." I frowned. "That's exactly what they called me, not according to your employment classification." She explained that years earlier, after multiple inspections, the hospital had quietly reclassified my position under critical infrastructure support because I was responsible for maintaining emergency systems required for federal accreditation. That designation carried specific staffing requirements. Specifically, any replacement had to demonstrate competency through supervised training before assuming independent responsibility. Rebecca paused just long enough to let that sink in. "Guess how long the regulations recommend?" I already knew the answer before she said it. 90 days. Exactly. And your replacements received 3. Suddenly everything made sense. The state wasn't investigating because equipment had failed. Equipment fails everywhere. They were investigating because executives knowingly removed the only qualified employee protecting those systems without ensuring qualified replacements existed. That transformed an internal staffing decision into a patient safety issue. The fines started arriving one after another like dominoes falling. Emergency engineering contracts, regulatory penalties, delayed procedure reimbursements, insurance disputes. Every day another report surfaced. Another meeting was called. Another executive spent hours explaining decisions that looked reasonable on a budget spreadsheet but catastrophic under legal scrutiny. Then, one quiet Tuesday afternoon, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. "Mr. Mercer?" the voice asked politely. "This is Michael Harrison, Chief Executive Officer of San E.S. Andrew Regional Medical Center. I'd appreciate the opportunity to meet with you and hopefully discuss how we can make this situation right." I looked across the room at Emily, who immediately knew who was calling just from my expression. I simply replied, "I'll be there, but I won't be coming alone." Rebecca and I arrived 10 minutes early, mostly because she believed the person who controls the room should never be the one rushing into it. We walked through the same front entrance where I'd spent nearly 17 years holding doors open for patients, carrying supplies during snowstorms, and fixing problems nobody upstairs even knew existed. This time, the receptionist stood up the second she saw me and quietly said, "Good afternoon, Mr. Mercer." It was amazing how quickly people remembered your name when lawyers got involved. The boardroom looked exactly like I remembered, except the confidence was gone. The chief executive officer stood first and shook my hand with both of his. Around the table sat board members, outside counsel, the chief financial officer, and Richard Collins. He looked older than he had 3 weeks earlier. Not physically, just smaller. The kind of smaller that comes from realizing arrogance has finally sent you the bill. The CEO cleared his throat. Daniel, before we discuss numbers, I want to apologize. We failed you. And more importantly, we failed the people who trusted us to make responsible decisions. I appreciated that he said we instead of blaming someone else. But apologies are easier when someone else has already calculated the damage. Rebecca slid a folder onto the table before anyone else spoke. Inside were copies of every maintenance recommendation I'd submitted over the years. Every email requesting permanent repairs instead of temporary workarounds. Every overtime call where I'd responded in the middle of the night without complaint. And every performance review describing me as essential to facility operations. Richard stared at those papers like he'd never seen them before. Maybe he hadn't. Maybe he'd signed budget reports without ever reading the names attached to them. The hospital's attorney finally pushed another folder toward us. We'd like to offer a settlement. Rebecca opened it first, read silently for a minute, then smiled without saying a word and passed it to me. Full back pay from the date of termination. A lump sum settlement large enough to cover every dollar Emily and I had spent worrying about her treatment. Full restoration of our family health insurance retroactive to the day they canceled it. A 5-year employment contract paying considerably more than I'd ever earned before. Guaranteed annual raises. Independent authority over facilities training. Most surprising of all, a written requirement that no critical systems employee could ever again be terminated or replaced without documented transition planning approved by qualified personnel. I looked up from the papers and asked only one question. Why? The CEO answered honestly, because this should have existed before you were fired. Nobody spoke for several seconds. Finally, Richard leaned forward. The confidence was completely gone now. Dan, I'd like to apologize personally. I let him continue. When I said custodial staff were a dime a dozen, he stopped, realizing there was no version of that sentence worth finishing. I was wrong. I nodded slowly. No, Richard, you were uninformed. There's a difference. He looked confused, so I explained. You never fired me because you hated me. You fired me because you never bothered learning what I actually did. The room became very quiet. I signed the agreement, and once the last signature dried, Richard tried one final time to lighten the mood. So, you'll train the new team now? I couldn't help smiling. Absolutely. His shoulders relaxed until I added, training starts Monday. 90 days minimum. Nobody touches emergency systems alone until they're ready. A few people around the table laughed softly because they understood exactly what I was referring to. It wasn't revenge. It was the standard that should have existed all along. During those 3 months, I taught those young contractors everything I knew. Not because the hospital deserved it, but because the patients did. They turned out to be hard-working guys who had been thrown into an impossible situation by executives trying to save money without understanding what experience was worth. We documented every workaround, rewrote outdated manuals, recorded video demonstrations, updated emergency procedures, and created checklists detailed enough that nobody would ever again become the single point of failure I had unknowingly become. 6 months later, the hospital passed its state inspection with the highest facilities rating it had received in years. Richard Collins quietly resigned before the end of the year. I never celebrated that. Losing a career is painful, even when someone has made terrible decisions. I simply hoped he learned the lesson that nearly cost the hospital everything. Emily finished her treatments a few months later, and the day her oncologist finally told us the scans looked clear, we walked out of the hospital holding hands through the same hallway I'd cleaned hundreds of times. For the first time, I wasn't looking at the floors or the ceiling vents or listening for strange mechanical noises. I was just looking at her. People still ask whether I planned the whole thing, whether I somehow knew the systems would fail after I left. The answer is no. I never wanted a single alarm to sound or one patient to be placed at risk. What happened wasn't caused by one employee leaving. It was caused by years of leadership believing institutional knowledge had no value until it disappeared. That's the real lesson. The most important person in an organization isn't always the one with the biggest office, the fanciest title, or the highest salary. Sometimes it's the quiet employee everyone walks past every day without noticing, the one who simply keeps everything working while everyone else takes the credit. So now I'd like to hear from you. Have you ever watched a company underestimate the wrong person? Or have you been that person yourself? Did the hospital deserve a second chance after admitting its mistake? Or should they have lived with the consequences? Share your thoughts in the comments because stories like this always spark strong opinions. And if you enjoyed this one, don't forget to like, subscribe, and join us for the next story about ordinary people proving they're far more valuable than anyone ever imagined.